everyone. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. I'm Jim Cardle. Do you have a right to privacy? And what exactly is behind the Apple iPhone versus FBI issue? Well, we have two experts today we're pleased to visit with who have thoughts and opinions on the issue. Daniel Schuman is the policy director for the Washington, D.C.-based Demand Progress. He has the ability to bring policy, law, and technology together based on his experience with the Sunlight Foundation and the Congressional Research Service. And Philip Molter is with Data Foundry's subsidiary Golden Frog, which provides a Viper VPN encryption service, one of the best in the nation. What's the basis behind the FBI's attempt to get into the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone? And what are the real implications for both society and the future of our nation? We're glad to be able to visit with Dan Schuman and Philip Molter today. Well, Daniel and Philip, thank you for coming in and joining us today.
Sure, thanks for having us.
This, as I mentioned in the introduction, is potentially such a big issue for users and consumers in society today. Some folks have said that it's got the impact potentially of Roe versus Wade or Brown versus Education on all kinds of implications or ramifications for our nation. Let's just go something very basic first of all and set the stage for the rest of our discussion. South by Southwest, you all have been here. You heard the president's comments on Friday, and I want to read a quote. He said that my conclusion so far is that you cannot take an absolutist view. If your argument is strong encryption, no matter what, and we can and should in fact create black boxes, I think that does not strike the kind of balance that we've lived for 200 years in this country with. Fetishizing over our phones is not the value. It can't be the right answer. Clearly he's trying to fudge a little bit, and yet at the same time does seem to be siding with the FBI and the ability of government having our personal information. You've had a day or two to think about it. People have been buzzing here at South by Southwest. Let's start with you, Philip. What do you think today, having heard the president and now a couple days later understanding what he's saying? What is the real thing he's saying?
Well, I think the real thing he's saying is, what we heard was give us our way, or we're going to make you give us our way. He's asking for compromise, but what he's really asking for is to do it our way. I come from the technology side of the business, so we make a lot of our decisions based on the technology itself. And in terms of encryption and strong encryption, there is no ability to compromise. If there's any weakening done to the encryption, it's just worthless at that point. And so you see a lot of pushback from the tech sector on what the government is asking them to do, because the government's coming in and telling them to say, nope, you can't do what is the right thing to do with encryption, which is to make it as strong as possible for the protection of the user. So I think he's asking for a very specific implementation. He's calling it compromise. The tech sector is very binary on this. This is not a compromise. This is a complete capitulation to it. And I think if he wants to have a valid conversation around it, he needs to go to the tech people and say, look, we understand you can't compromise on this piece, but we need some help. Can we get some help from you? But that's not what he said. He said, do it my way or do it the hard way.
A lot of folks coming to that realization, I think, although the initial reaction, it was a little confusing. Daniel, from a Washington, D.C. policy and grassroots expert, what's he saying?
Well, so he's trying to bring a political solution to what is ultimately a technological problem. You know, politicians often try to find the middle way, try to make everybody happy. Mm-hmm. But when you're coming to questions about science, this is not a question of whether the Earth is flat or whether the Earth is round, right? I mean, this is not something that you can be like, well, it's middle ground, maybe it's an oval. This is actually something that is amenable to scientific understanding. And when you talk to people who are technology experts, they say you either have strong encryption or you don't have encryption, right? The middle path of weak encryption is basically saying that you don't have encryption. And while we can understand why he's trying to straddle, he has competing demands on his administration. He has the intelligence and the police folks on one side saying, we really need this to do a whole host of things. But when you look at it from a substantive perspective, when you look at it from a policy perspective, this ultimately does not serve the government's interests, it doesn't serve the interests of the American people. In an effort to straddle in this kind of way, it doesn't just leave most people being unsatisfied, it doesn't accomplish the things that the president himself has said that he's trying to do. And that's where his speech on Friday was really disappointing. He didn't do what he needed to do.
So off we go into a political sector. It was interesting how initially the tech industry didn't know how to react, I think would be an accurate way to describe it. Within a week, tech sector has come out by and large, if not totally, backing Apple and their product and their privacy. Let's talk about from a practical implication, Daniel, for you on the legislative front. But first, Philip, what's the practical implication of encryption and breaking encryption and the tech sector so dependent, frankly, and Apple's to be commended for making something that is sold because it is secure. People buy it because it is secure. What are the practical private sector implications of what he's talking about?
Well, what's wonderful is that we don't have to theorize about what the practical implications are of this. We've already gone through this debate in the country. We had this back in the 90s during the Clipper chip wars and the export regulations on encryption. We had a period of time where this country wouldn't let our companies export strong encryption. And what the Clinton administration discovered from that was that it hurts American business. It makes it so that other companies can't trust us, so they can't trust our products. And what the Clinton administration saw was that if we continue down that path, America won't be the leader in this space. So without strong encryption, we can't provide trustworthy products to companies and corporations and individuals all over the world. We'll become sidelined. We'll become like China, where we don't trust the products that come out of China because we know the government wants to manipulate that data. We'll be the same way, and it'll hurt our business, and it will make us become a weaker country overall. Other businesses will take the lead in the vanguard on that, and eventually we'll sideline ourselves.
So you, Golden Frog, and Viper VPN sell a product that is phone computer encryption. A lot of companies have said we can't stand to live in America anymore because they're afraid of their product being protected. Is that a real thing that we see corporations in America losing business because of the fact that they're afraid or legislators will potentially weaken the constitutional protections of their products?
Absolutely. Forrester Research has done some papers out on this about what the potential impact could be. I like to point to the UK, where they are pushing through similar regulations that they call the Snoopers Charter. And in the Snoopers Charter, UK businesses have already come out and said that if this passes, we will have to leave. We will not be able to conduct business the way we need to be able to conduct business in the UK. So if we continue down this path in the US, the same thing's going to happen here. Businesses are going to try to push their operations and their business outside the U.S. The U.S. won't be able to get that tax revenue anymore. They won't be able to control it, and it'll hurt American jobs. It'll hurt those businesses.
Daniel, you're in D.C. You're in the policy advocacy effort, and this debate has clearly now moved from just the courts with Apple and FBI into the public with President Obama. I think, or tell us what you think. I think most congressional elected officials that have studied this have come down perhaps on the side of protecting the Constitution and civil rights. But what about the debate moving into the legislative and the policy arena? What's the outlook or the impact for congressional action?
Well, so there's a couple of really interesting things that have happened. One is that the president has said that he is not seeking a legislative solution. That is another way of saying that we're going to do this inside the executive branch, and we're going to do this going through the courts. If Apple loses, this sets a precedent by which the government will continue to demand access to more phones at the federal, state, and local levels, to break into iPhones, to break into your computers, to break into all these kinds of things, whether it's with warrants or whether in other circumstances as well, if it's for national security purposes. So this is basically what the administration doing what the administration has said it's going to do, which is that they are going to lead and they are going to leave Congress behind. But Congress is the entity that is responsible for making these kinds of determinations. Mm-hmm. That is why we have a legislature in the first place. Mm-hmm. So let them work their way through this issue. Let them bring people in to testify. Let them have experts who can help guide them on what is and is not possible. the president's framing this in the terms of debate over a phone. These aren't phones, right? This isn't the rotary phone from like 20 years ago. This is all the information about every place that you've been, everyone that you've been in contact with, all these kinds of, basically all the information about every intimate aspect of your life that you carry around in your pocket. And to say that they're going to be able to break this because, well, the context here is national security, right? But it's not about that. It's the IRS is curious about, maybe did you pay your taxes appropriately? The DEA is curious about whether you, whether you're engaged in drug violations. The local government's concerned, maybe they even pay your parking tickets. They want to see where you are. There is no end to this particular approach, which is why you need to have a legislature draw the line. When you have a court address it, they look at this particular case. They don't look at the underlying policy implications. And when you deal with something as vital to American security and to commerce as encryption, you can't have these things decided one at a time in this kind of way. That is not the way that our system of power, of separated powers was set up. Congress needs to go look into the issue, and that's the place, that's the appropriate place for these decisions to be made. You should not be relying on the FBI driving this through a poorly chosen lawsuit to try to get the courts to create a precedent that will then undermine encryption from this point going forward.
And a lot of analysts have said, or a lot of tech sector folks have said, this is a debate that has been a long time coming. We've known that it was going to be a question. It was not if it was going to be a question, but just a question of when it would become the question. Let me look at this at a little different perspective, perhaps. At the South by Southwest panel the other night that I was fortunate enough to moderate, and Philip, your company, Golden Frog, was one of the sponsors of that. Somebody mentioned to me afterward that suppose you're the only person in the country, there's 234 million Americans, suppose you're the only person in the country who has the knowledge and the ability to break an Apple iPhone, to go into the back door of the Apple iPhone, and the FBI comes to you and says, you're going to do this, and if you don't, you're going to jail. That is essentially, I think, a good analogy of what the FBI is asking Apple to do. It's forcing a private sector entity. Corporations can be viewed as a personal. The analogy is transferable. Look at it from that standpoint, breaking into the back end, Philip, from a private sector perspective, what are the implications of that?
Well, it's an incredible civil rights implication, right? In this country, our government does not compel us to do things. It's one of our basic rights. And that extends to corporations as too. The government does not compel us to do things a certain way, or to do certain things.
Not yet. That's
not
the ground-setting perspective.
That's correct. Not yet, and hopefully it won't be the case. That's one of the foundations of our country.
Right.
Technologically, what it really comes down to is that we can't put our resources where we want to put them, and maybe where we need to put them. We have to put them where the government wants us to put them, and that's never a good solution. That stifles innovation. That stifles our growth as companies in the marketplace. And so I think you see a lot of pushback from the tech sector from that, because they're like, this is not something that we want to do. It's not something that we should do, and we have better things to be doing than to be worrying about this.
Danielle, from a policy perspective, you used to work for the Congressional Research Service up in Washington, D.C., and have provided nonpartisan analysis on all kinds of issues. The FBI says you've got to do this. The public sector's demanding that corporations actually do something, a very scary precedent, possibly.
It certainly is. So when the courts have looked at these kinds of questions, there's a Supreme Court decision from the 70s called New York Telephone Company. And that was an instance where the government was trying to basically keep track of who somebody called. In that particular case, I think it was the FBI, but the government went to sort of track one particular company that was in the business of already doing these pen traces. So they already were in the business of tracking who was being contacted. It wasn't something that was hard for them to do. It was something that was in the normal course of their business.
Okay.
That is very different from what's going on here. Apple is not in the business of creating GovOS, right? Operating systems that are for government purposes. Apple is not in the business of making weak encryption. When you look at the testimony that has been submitted in the Apple case, they said that it would take a team of technologists 2 to 4 weeks to go and build this operating system, that it would require a number of people to do it, that you'd have to maintain it in perpetuity, that is a target for hackers to try to get their hands on, and you have to do this process again and again for each phone that they're trying to break. This is basically the equivalent of taking a loaded gun and putting it on the table in front of a kid, spinning around and just saying, oh, well, nothing bad is going to come from this. The burden is tremendous on these companies. It implicates basic aspects of the way they conduct their business. And what's going to happen is these businesses are going to go overseas. They're going to go and rely on foreign protections to do the work that they do. Or if we don't end up in that circumstance, the other way we'll end up is that we simply not have encryption that works for us. And that's going to push everything back. As it is right now, on your computer, you're probably running Microsoft Word or something like that.
Okay.
When it's time for you to get an update, you get an update automatically pushed to your computer.
Yes.
That keeps all of us safe. That addresses malware. But when you go, like the government's trying to do, when you break that update system, no one is going to trust these automatic updates, which means that the viruses that they're intended to protect against will be more likely to get through. This destroys this entire internet economy that we've built over the last 10 or 15 years, where you can no longer trust your devices are going to behave as they should, that the update mechanism is designed to keep you safe, that when you talk to your bank, that when you deal with your doctor, all these kinds of, the things that are designed to keep all this information safe will become less safe and less secure. And this isn't just those of us on the private sector. The government uses Microsoft too. And we have seen, 22, 23 million people have their information stolen through the latest OPM breach. We know
That's
that.
the Office of Personnel
That's
Management
right.
for
Sorry,
the government.
I've been in DC too long. I tend to speak in acronyms.
Uh-huh.
We know that the Chinese are trying to hack into our systems. We see millions of efforts by folks to hack into the systems on a daily basis. If you create backdoors into commonly used technology that all of us rely on, including the government, what you're doing is ultimately making all of us less secure. And this is not a decision that should be made based on the FBI's determination in one case before one court. This is something that requires thoughtful, measured approach that requires all of us to work together and work it through, and not what we're seeing now. So it's a really dangerous situation where you compel companies in this way.
Again, folks, we want to thank you for joining us on Texas Insider TV. We're visiting today with Philip Molter from Golden Frog here in Austin and Daniel Schuman with Demand Progress on the FBI versus Apple issue. Daniel, you mentioned the constant updates that folks get on their computers or on their cell phones. You get updates from Facebook, you get updates from Snapchat. Mm-hmm. It's a good constant thing that happens. But after the Southwest panel the other night that you both were panelists on, somebody also mentioned to me the perspective that Apple makes the phone, but once they sell it, they don't own it or the content. Conversely, AT&T and the phone companies don't make the phone. They have Samsung or somebody else do that. But once you buy it from them and you sign that contract, users do not realize that they own the phone and they own your content. Philip, talk about that perspective. You're in the business of encryption and cloud storage and securing people's information. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, what we're really talking about with regards to AT&T has been deputized by the government. They allowed themselves to be deputized by the government, right? Mm-hmm. Way back when they said, government, go ahead, come in and install your equipment on our phone lines and tap everybody's internet communications, they said, we're effectively operating as a long arm of the government here and we'll support what you do. Apple's taking a different stand. Apple's saying, we're not going to allow ourselves to be deputized by the government. That we make our products for our users. If the government wants the user's cooperation in this, they don't go through us, they go through the user. So the implication of the court case is, can the government force Apple to become a deputized arm of the government? Okay. And I think the argument is no. Even though Apple may have a certain level of capability with the devices, not control, not ownership, but a certain level of capability with the devices, that doesn't give them the right to go in and make unilateral decisions for the users of those devices. Even if AT&T has done that through their own choice, that doesn't mean the government has the right to force that on Apple. So, the Apple case means a lot for a lot of companies. It means stuff for like Golden Frog, where we protect users' communications. Can the government come in and say, look, we don't want you to protect users' communications as well, or to protect these users' communications, and we don't want to be compelled to do that. And we make those choices today. We make them for us, we make them on the basis of what's best for our user. Some companies make them on the decision on what's best for the company, and some make them on what's best for the government, like AT&T. But we think the right way is based on the user, give the user their level of control. And if the government wants that information, they can go through the user. They have the means to be able to do that.
So, Daniel, before we go to you, I just want to clarify, because this was an absolutely earth-shattering realization for me. You mentioned AT&T's been deputized. It is a bit of a tech sector versus communications phones sector. It is accurate that when you say AT&T has been deputized, AT&T does collect, and the phone companies do collect information for the government, where right now the tech sector by and large does not.
Well, I mean, all the reports about what AT&T is doing with the government have, of course, been classified, and NSA won't talk about them, and AT&T won't talk about them.
Right.
But what's been reported and what AT&T has not been disputed is that they have allowed the government to come in and install their own equipment and to tap those communications, and they have even been they've even been granted immunity by the government against their actions in this regard. So there isn't really any dispute that AT&T is certainly cooperating with the government and has some level of involvement with the government's activities. And to do that, you have to basically say, we agree with what the government is doing, we want them to be able to do it, and we're going to allow them, and in some cases even help them do it, and that is deputizing, yes.
And they even get paid for providing that service. It's a money stream.
Potentially, I know that Daniel's trying to get that information out of them, so.
Yeah, Daniel, AT&T doesn't make the phone,
Right.
they sell the phone.
Right.
Apple makes the phone. Once they sell it, they don't own the phone. What are we talking about here for implications of a consumer in America?
Well, so first I just want to come back to AT&T. So there is a difference between companies that comply with lawful warrants and the warrants that are reasonable. AT&T goes further than that, right? So AT&T isn't just, if the government comes in and says that we need something, and they do it through appropriate legal process that they're going to apply, AT&T bends over backwards to be helpful to the government when the government doesn't go through these processes as well. I mean, I hate to come down to Texas and cite the New York Times. I should probably cite a local paper instead.
Try us.
But the New York Times had an article just a couple months ago that talked about how AT&T is the opposite of the type of company that consumers want to do business with. That they they can't help but share more and more information with the government.
Really?
These are not the folks that you should be trusting your data to. There are better companies, actually, every other company just about is better than AT&T when it comes to providing telecommunications service. So that when you go and you get your cell phone or whatever plan that you happen to have and you have a choice, these are not the people that you want to deal with.
Are there any telephone companies that, in fact, do not run into this situation? I know it's done almost universally amongst a lot of the telephone companies. What's a consumer to do?
Well, there are companies that are better. But even for the better companies, a lot of the backbone is still owned by AT&T. So ultimately, you're still stuck that AT&T is basically the government's arm, and they are a very willing, happy, and able accomplice to taking information that hasn't been required through legal process and providing it. So one thing as consumers you can do is you can speak out and you can say, I'm not going to engage in services with this company to the extent that I can help it. If you're a shareholder, you can speak out and say, this is not the type of company that I wish to invest in. And you can send a signal to the market that this is not the type of thing that you wish to allow. Now there's sort of a second piece, and this is what you were talking about before, which is when government comes in and they have a lawful warrant and they say, okay, you need to provide this information. No, that's circumstances where providers are required to follow the law.
It's different than forcing to break your product.
Right, and that's the point that I'm getting at. There's a difference between, so there was another law that came out of the 70s called CULIA, which has to do with being able to engage in wiretaps. And in that law, they made a decision that they were not going to apply to information service providers and that they were not going to affect the way encryption works. That if you choose to encrypt things yourself, this is something that Congress explicitly said we're not going to deal with this here. And this is an effort by the government to sort of take these issues and sort of swirl them around a little bit and say, okay, we're going to go and we're going to treat Apple as if they were AT&T. And they're not. If people choose to protect their information through Apple or through any other product, then they should be able to do so. If the government believes that I have encrypted information on my phone that they want to have access to, the appropriate thing to do is to bring a warrant to me and say, produce this information.
Show probable cause, get a warrant.
Yep, and then there are ways of addressing access to that. it's not perfect, right? There are always going to be gaps. You know, the FBI and others talk about going dark. Well, the truth is the government doesn't have a right to know everything about everything all the time. You know, it was only recently the fact that we carry around these personalized trackers in our pockets that that someone can come in and remotely turn on the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you then from this perspective, because the debate has been, and politicians come at it from the viewpoint of cybersecurity,
Yep.
protecting the homeland, protecting the nation. But there's really the distinction that needs to be made, and in consumers' mind is just now being realized. There is a difference between cybersecurity and cyber surveillance, which is what we have now, correct?
I think that's exactly right. You know, and just to sort of push out a little bit differently, the debate's being framed as security versus privacy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a useful way of looking at it, but I really think the debate is security versus security.
Okay.
This is about the government's ability to secure itself against hackers. This is about individuals' ability to secure themselves against hackers and other folks who would want to do them harm.
Okay.
And when we think about it in those terms, on one hand you have the false sense of security that breaking encryption provides. And on the other hand, you have the real security that encryption provides for our government and for ourselves to be secure in our homes and secure in our papers, to engage in commerce, to be protected from those who wish to steal our identities or otherwise do harm to us. I don't think it's really that hard a debate. When you look at it from a policy perspective of what the right thing to do is based on the technology, this is not a hard issue. It's only a hard issue for those who are in government who feel, you know, politicians are driven by concern about the bad things that can happen. They're concerned, well, maybe this will prevent the next terrorist attack. Well, the truth is, it won't. This is not going to make that kind of a difference. But it will prevent is an attack on our infrastructure. This will prevent attacks on our electric grid going down. This will prevent attacks on Wall Street. This will prevent those kinds of things. But the nature of this kind of conversation is being framed very narrowly, so that the real dangers of weakening encryption are not the things that the president and other folks are discussing. And that's where the debate needs to be.
And thank goodness we've got an increasingly educated and wary consumer and public. Philip, the cybersecurity versus cyber surveillance, goldenfrog.com, Viper VPN provides encrypting services. What do you see within the industry is the difference?
Well,
what are folks talking about?
Well, security is a very personal thing, and you talked about framing a discussion between security and privacy. It's really important to say that to have privacy, you need to have good cybersecurity. If we're going to put our information outside of our brains onto our devices, then we have to be able to secure that information, or else it won't be private. So the two go hand in hand. I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing here with the government's efforts with FBI, this is about stored communications. They are trying to extend the surveillance precedent that was set with the Patriot Act into that physical realm. They're trying to turn this case into a means to further expand the surveillance state. And you see the tech companies pushing back because they've already been through and they already sort of lost round one on that because of the actions of companies like AT&T who made those decisions for them. And now they have, well, look, we have more control here. We can make this decision and we can make the right decision.
One final question, and we'll let you folks get back to your day jobs. And this was a question that I asked at the South by panel that you all have heard before. If Steve Jobs' legacy was to create Apple and encrypt devices and have it be one of the best products out there, is Tim Cook, or to what extent is Apple President Tim Cook now going to be forced to have this battle define his legacy? Daniel, let's go with you first.
Well, I think that this will be his legacy. And the question is going to be, to what extent are they going to continue to push back? We can see what they're doing in the public space, at least the legal arguments are going back and forth. We don't see what's happening privately. I mean, we know that there were 80 phones that Apple has helped get into. And historically, for the less secure versions of the iPhones, they've been helpful there as well.
And they finally put their foot down.
And they finally put their foot down. And we have to hope that Apple continues to be a good corporate citizen and protect the rights of its customers. We have to, and if not them, we need to continue to look for champions who will be doing that kind of thing. It is only through their efforts to keep us secure that we even know about what's going on. And we need to encourage more companies to think about the big picture and to protect all of us.
Philip, what's Tim Cook's implication and corporate America's?
Absolutely. I think this Tim Cook sees it as part of his legacy. We can see in the way that he engages with the press on this that he's very actively engaged. I think he has a slightly different view of oppression than most Americans do. One of the things I think, we talk about this being a real precedent-setting case. You mentioned cases like Roe v. Wade and Brown versus Board of Education. Tim Cook sits out there and he looks at this and he says, do we want to be on the side of Plessy versus Ferguson, or do we want to be on the side of Brown versus Board of Education when history evaluates us? Apple looks at itself as a leader in the tech space, not just in terms of security, but in terms of user trust and user usage of their products. Right? They go super high end, and this security piece is part of high end implementations of hardware. So I think as we go forward, they're going to set the example for the rest of the technical industry that, look, when you want to implement a good product, you need to think about security and you need to think about your users and not think about big data and not think about having this stuff out in the open. So I think that'll be his legacy if this pushes through the way he wants it to.
Well, interesting perspective. This is going to be an issue that continues in the public debate. We hope to have you folks back in. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Folks, do you have a right to privacy, and what is the backdoor encryption solution? We don't know yet, but we're going to continue to talk about it. We've been visiting today with Daniel Schuman from demandprogress.org and Philip Molter from goldenfrog.com. We appreciate again you all coming in. And be sure and tune back in for future editions of Texas Insider TV, because you're either an insider or you're not. I'm Jim Cardle. Thanks for joining us.